Glory Cloud Podcast, episode number 7. Stay tuned because we're going to continue answering listener questions in just a moment. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. In this episode, Charles Lee Irons and I are going to pick up where we left off in the last episode by answering 3 more listener questions. Question number 4. Can you summarize the critique of Klinean Republication in the book Merit and Moses by Andrew Elam, Robert Van Coten, and Randall Bergquist?
Sure. So I recommend people to get a hold of that book and read it. It is a very strident and strong critique of Klinean Republication, but you should still read it and wrestle with their arguments. Their arguments are very carefully laid out, very calmly laid out, very logically laid out. I don't agree with them, but it's not just an angry expression of how much they dislike Kline. It's also a serious theological critique. And, there's a lot of things in that book. And if you want to read more, you can read my 43-page response on my website. But boil it all down, there's 2 main things that they're bringing up in this book. First point is this. They argue that Klinean Republication teaches that a group of fallen sinners, so this would be Israel, can merit or extract a blessing from God. Now, by blessing from God, they're acknowledging that for Kline, this is the earthly blessings in the land, not eternal life. But still, they are concerned that it teaches that a group of fallen sinners can merit or extract a blessing from God. And that is, in their view, just fundamentally contradictory to baseline Augustinian theology, which says that no one after the fall can merit anything from God. And so they would say, by implication then, that there is a form of Pelagianism, perhaps, or a Pelagian implication from Klinean Republication. I don't think they're saying that Klineans are Pelagians per se. That'd be a pretty radical charge. But that there's something about it that has a Pelagian tint to it, and so we should reject Klinean Republication just because it has this concept in it that fallen sinners can merit or extract a blessing from God. How do we respond to that? Well, first of all, one of the key things to note is that Kline recognized that there is, at this typological level, we're talking about this first level fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant, which has to do with the land of Canaan. Kline recognized that typological layer was not something that Israel earned by their own righteousness. They were given that by God's grace. Where the works principle comes in is that once they're given that, once they're brought into the land, their ability to retain the land and to have long life in the land is contingent upon national fidelity to that Sinai covenant. And so it's not quite true to say that Kline would say that fallen sinners can merit or extract a blessing from God. Kline also pointed out that Moses himself, when he is talking to the Israelites as they're about, just before Moses dies and before they go into the land, they're about to cross over the Jordan, and Moses himself warns them in Deuteronomy 9, verses 4 through 6, not to think that they're going in and possessing this land because of their righteousness. He says, do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. Verse 5, not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations. and that he may confirm the word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. There's the Abrahamic covenant again, just like we saw in Exodus 32:13. It comes up again here. Verse 6, know therefore that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people. So 3 times Moses makes clear and exhorts them to not get the wrong idea. So even though there is a works principle being introduced here at this typological layer, Moses exhorts them and warns them not to get the wrong idea and to think that they are the recipient of this typological inheritance because of their righteousness. And so Kline has a great quote on page 128 of God, Heaven, and Har Magedon, where he says this very thing. He says, the Old Covenant order, theirs by national election, was one of highest historical privilege. And while a works principle was operative both in the grant of the kingdom to Abraham and in the meting out of typological kingdom blessings to the nation of Israel, the arrangement as a whole was a gracious favor to fallen sons of Adam, children of wrath, deserving no blessings, temporal or eternal. That last phrase, they were fallen sons of Adam, children of wrath, deserving no blessings, temporal or eternal, is pretty clear. You know, it's directly contradicting what the book Merit and Moses is charging Kline of saying. They're charging Kline of saying that he teaches that a group of fallen sinners can merit or extract a blessing from God. And then they add the footnote, of course, we're talking about temporal blessings, but to them, it doesn't make any difference whether it's temporal or eternal. You're still saying that fallen sinners can merit something with God. And Kline is saying, no, the arrangement as a whole was a gracious favor to the fallen sons of Adam, and that they did not deserve these blessings, temporal or eternal. And so if we want to talk about merit in the Mosaic economy, if we want to say that if Israel had kept the covenant, that they would have merited temporal blessings in the land, and I say if because Kline almost never uses that language. I think there may only be 1 or 2 places where he does. Very rare. But let's say we did want to use that language and say that what God was expecting them to do was to obey God, and as a result of obeying God, to retain the land, and that could be called merit in some way. We have to immediately say we're not talking about merit in the ultimate sense of actually meriting or extracting a blessing from God. We're talking about typological merit. The merit is only typological. It's not actual merit. So Kline would be very clear that the only place where you see actual merit, the only place where it could have happened and where it did happen, is with Adam in the garden and with Christ. With Adam in the garden, it didn't actually happen because he disobeyed. But if he had kept the probation, he would have merited the reward. And with Christ, of course, his active and passive obedience is in fact meritorious as well. But in between those, if you're just talking about, Israel in the land or any other kind of obedience, it's only a type of the merit of Christ. It's only typological merit.
Okay.
And he also said that Noah and Abraham were pictures of the active obedience of Christ. And so with them, he was very clear that the obedience of Noah, because, it talks about how Noah was the only one that was righteous in God's eyes at that time. And the same thing with Abraham, he says in Genesis 22, because you have done this and not withheld your son, therefore I'm going to give you the land. But in these cases, when the Old Testament speaks of the obedience of Noah and of Abraham as being rewarded by God, Kline would say that in and of itself, that obedience is not perfect. It's the obedience that flows from faith because of their trust in the Messiah to come. But God invested that outstanding service and obedience that they performed to God with typological significance so that Noah and Abraham could be viewed as types of Christ, and that their obedience could be viewed as typological of the active obedience of Christ. But it's not actual obedience or not actual merit. It's just typological merit. He uses the language of having an analogous kind of value, Kingdom Prologue 3:25, that Abraham's works were accorded by God an analogous kind of value, analogous to the obedience of Christ, but not actual meritorious obedience. So basically, I mean, to boil it all down, simply, merit in Moses is misreading Kline and putting the worst construction upon what he's trying to say, and not looking at the typological nature of what we're talking about. Just like you said in the previous question, Chris, are we just talking about the relationship between the type and the antitype?
Right.
Yeah, it boils back down to that again.
And you've also, you mentioned your lengthy response on your website to merit in Moses. But I want, especially if we're going to ask readers to go out and get merit in Moses and read it, I want to encourage our listeners to read your response as well. And in terms of what Lee was just responding to, see especially his response to the core argument, and we'll link to that in the show notes. Yeah,
so that's a section in that long paper, but it's only 3 or 4 pages long, and the subtitle of that section is called Response to the Core Argument of the Merit in Moses book.
Okay.
But I mean, basically, one way to get at this whole thing is to ask yourself this question. We believe that there are types throughout the Old Testament of the passive obedience of Christ. Right? I mean, we believe in the sacrificial system, the Passover lamb. Those are types of the passive obedience of Christ. Passive meaning the obedience of Christ in terms of his sufferings, right? His suffering and enduring the curse of the law, the wrath of God in our place, taking away the guilt of our sin as the suffering servant. Well, if we believe that, if we believe that there are types of the passive obedience of Christ in the Old Testament, should we be surprised if there are also types of the active obedience of Christ in the Old Testament?
No.
Yeah, it just boggles the mind to think that God would ordain types of the passive obedience, but not of the active obedience. So anytime you see anyone in the Old Testament obeying God, and then as a result, God is rewarding them for their obedience, more often than not, I mean, I guess there could be cases where it's actually talking about some kind of evangelical obedience. But more often than not, if you're talking about Moses, if you're talking about Israel, if you're talking about the Davidic kings, if you're looking at Abraham or Noah, whenever they do some outstanding work of obedience and then God rewards them and says there's going to be a future kingdom that's going to be bestowed because of that obedience. Phinehas, right? Another example, when he executes God's judgment upon the sinful couple, those are all types of the active obedience of Christ. Now, if you look at those acts of obedience just from the Ordo Salutis point of view, just from the point of view of Noah or Phinehas or David or whoever, as a godly individual, as an elect individual who's looking ahead to the Messiah to come, that act of obedience that they're doing in that story is not perfect obedience. It's imperfect. It's the obedience that flows from faith. It's evangelical obedience. It's wrought in their hearts by the Spirit of God. It's not performed in their own strength. It's not obedience under a covenant of works, at least not an actual covenant of works. So if you're just looking at it from that point of view, yeah, that's what it is. But if you're looking at it from the broader point of view of the big picture of what God is doing typologically in redemptive history, then you can see how God is investing that act of obedience with an analogical significance so that it does point ahead to the active obedience of Christ. And I don't see why that's a problem. I don't see why it can't be both. It can be from the Ordo Salutis point of view, it's evangelical obedience, but from the Historia Salutis point of view, it's the active obedience of Christ in typological form.
Right.
Okay, so let's look at the second main critique. I'm really simplifying their book here. Merit in Moses has a lot of things in it that they're saying. But, the first one is just this issue of Klinean Republication teaches that a group of fallen sinners can merit a blessing from God. But the second thing is Klinean Republication creates spiritual schizophrenia in the piety of the Old Testament believers. So what they're saying here is, they're saying if Klinean Republication is true, which they don't think it is, but if it, wouldn't the Old Testament believers just be completely schizophrenic? I mean, on the one hand, like I was just saying, right, just a second ago about the two ways of looking at the obedience of Noah or Phineas or Abraham or whoever. They're saying, Andrew Elam, Robert Van Coten, and Randall Berquist are saying, wouldn't that be schizophrenic for them? On the one hand, they're doing this obedience out of faith and responding to God's grace, and it's imperfect, but God is condescending to reward their imperfect obedience. But on the other hand, you're saying that it's typological of the perfect, meritorious, active obedience of Christ. So wouldn't this be schizophrenic for them, where on the one hand they're acting in light of and on the basis of the principles of grace, but on the other hand, they're also acting in this other arena that has to do with the covenant of works? And I would say the best way to answer this is to divide the question into two different groups. So on the one hand, we have those individuals who were set apart by God as having a very special role in the unfolding of God's covenant plan. You know, I mean, not everyone was a Noah, not everyone was an Abraham, right? These are unique individuals whom God ordained to have a unique purpose and function and role and calling in the Old Testament. I mean, especially after the Sinai covenant is put in place, you have theocratic officers like Moses and Joshua. And then after that, you have the judges of Israel. And then you have the Davidic kings. And these are unique individuals that are being appointed and set apart by a special call to have a special role within this typological kingdom that they are set up to function in. And so for them, you have to look at those individuals differently from how you look at the ordinary Joe Israelite. I don't know, what would be a better term for Joe Israelite? Shlomo Israelite? I don't know. So Yitzchak Israelite? I don't know. But whatever the average Hebrew name is for a typical Israelite, that's different. So I think for those individuals like Noah, Moses, and so on, there is no schizophrenia for them because they knew, didn't they, to some extent? I mean, they didn't understand all the fullness of what God was doing, but they knew that they were being called and appointed to some kind of special office. Right? I mean, Moses knew that. Moses was very aware of the fact that God called him at the burning bush and ordained him to this very special role. And he felt totally inadequate for it. But he knew that he was called to do something. David knew it. Right. You know, David was conscious of the fact that God had called him to be the anointed king of Israel. And that he was even, inspired by the Spirit and functioned not only as a king, but also as a prophet who wrote scripture. And so I think that these special theocratic officers, which are the ones we're most concerned about, because those are the ones that had this second layer where their obedience could function in this way of being a type of the merit of Christ. I think that there was no schizophrenia for them because they knew that they were being set apart for a special function and that they were actually functioning as types of the Messiah to come in some way. And that's why they felt so inadequate, Right. That's why they knew that they weren't worthy of it. David said, "Who am I, O Lord, that you would show all this kindness and grace to me?" And yet through it all, he was able to know his inadequacy, and yet through it, he was able to look ahead to his own greater Lord, Mm-hmm. I mean, Jesus himself says, David said, "The Lord said unto my Lord." And so Jesus is pointing out how David called the Messiah his own Lord. So David had some kind of faith in the Messiah to come. So that I think, we were dividing the question here. So that class of individuals in the Old Testament does not have schizophrenia in their piety because they're aware of these two layers. What about ordinary Shlomo Israelite? Well, I would say there's no schizophrenia for them not because they were set apart in some special way, they weren't, but because they knew that they weren't obedient, right? If they're elect and they're regenerate, they were conscious of their guilt.
Right.
And that's why they availed themselves of the sacrificial system. And they would lay their hand upon the head of the animal to symbolize transferring their guilt to the animal, and then the animal would die in their place. So there's no schizophrenia. They know that they're saved by grace alone on the basis of the covenant of grace established in Genesis 3:15, renewed at the Abrahamic covenant, continuing on through the means of atonement and the sacrificial system. And yet they also know that there's this law over them, and it says you have to do all these things in order to live, and if you don't do them, you'll die. And so what do? Well, when they sin, they know that they're supposed to die, and so they bring an offering, they sacrifice the offering, and the offering dies in their place. So I don't see the schizophrenia.
No. And it would have made that sacrificial system just so precious to Shlomo Israelite.
Right.
So,
and you even see David himself experiencing, even though he was a theocratic officer and he had this high exalted role, yet at the same time, Psalm 51, it puts him right in the shoes of Shlomo Israelite, and recognizing his sin and guilt and confessing his sin and trusting in the promises of God's grace and forgiveness. So there is no conflict.
Nope. But,
in this book, Merritt and Moses, they make a big deal out of this. They not only call it spiritual schizophrenia, they call it tug of war. There's a tug of war between these two principles. There's confusion in the minds of the Israelites. They think that the Israelites would have been encouraged by this typological covenant of works and the idea of, quote unquote, meriting temporal blessings. They would have been encouraged from that to think that they could be saved by works. And I don't see that because of what Paul says in Galatians 3, that the law was actually given to shut them up and to show them their inability to keep the law and to lead them to Christ, or even before Christ comes, to lead them to the sacrificial system, which leads them to Christ.
Right. So, their big concern is, well, what about the Israelite? Wouldn't they be at least confused, if not schizophrenic, to use the word that they use? But, Lee, I think our concern is what becomes of the New Covenant believer if we say that the transaction on Mount Sinai was gracious. I mean, if that does end up messing with the doctrine of justification, then we've got Christians that are depressed, that they're unable to live up to the law's demands.
Absolutely. So, so we could turn the charge on its head and say, well, but your view could lead to schizophrenia in the New Covenant.
Right.
Right? Yeah, I think that's a valid concern. That just goes back to what we were saying before in a previous question, but yeah.
So does that wrap up our summary of Merritt and Moses then?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Question number 5. Kline says that if God takes the oath, it is a covenant of grace. But if man takes the oath, it is a covenant of works. I see where God took the oath in Genesis 15 and where Israel took the oath in Exodus 24. But I don't read where it says that Adam took the oath.
Okay, this is a good question. And you're right. The Genesis 2 narration of the covenant of works with Adam does not explicitly say that Adam took the oath. Kline himself actually deals with this in Kingdom Prologue, near the very beginning, actually. If you're interested in looking this up, it's Kingdom Prologue, the very first section there, pages 1 through 13, where he talks about, sorry, not 1 through 13, 1 through 7, where he talks about the covenant, and he talks about this whole issue of who takes the oath. And then he brings it up again in pages 14 and following, 14 through 21. And in there, basically what Klein argues, to make it simple, is this, that you don't always have to find a reference to the word covenant, or in Hebrew, berit, and you don't have to necessarily see an actual reference to an oath being taken in order to know that a particular transaction is a covenant transaction. And the prime example of this is in 2 Samuel 7, when God reveals the Davidic covenant. In 2 Samuel 7, which is the first passage that deals with the revelation of this covenant, the word berit is not used, and there's no reference to an oath. And yet we know from later revelation that it was a covenant and that there was an oath. For example, in Psalm 89, verse 3, the author says, this is a maskil of Ethan the Ezrahite, looking back upon the Davidic covenant. You have said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David, my servant, quote, I will establish your offspring forever and build your throne for all generations. So there you have both, berit and the oath swearing. Also in verse 35 or verse 34, I will not violate my covenant or alter the word that went forth from my lips. Once for all I have sworn by my holiness, I will not lie to David. So Psalm 89, which is much later, it's not even David himself, it's Ethan the Ezrahite, but he's looking back upon the narration of the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7, and he's saying, that was a covenant. And also God swore an oath. And here it's clear that God is the one swearing the oath, because he swears by himself, by his holiness. David isn't the one swearing, it's God who's swearing. And so that shows us that the Davidic covenant is essentially a covenant of promise and guarantee that is fulfilled in Christ. So the covenant language of berit and oath does not have to be explicit, it can be implied. So when we look at Genesis 2, and to be more fair, we should look at the whole context of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. Because Genesis 1 is also covenantal, even though it's talking about the creation, Klein believes that the act of creation itself is covenantal. So Genesis 1, 2, and 3 as a whole, when we look at that whole passage, we can see the evidence there that it is a covenant. The oath is not mentioned explicitly, but it's implied. And it's implied by the fact that there are these two sanctions, the dual sanctions of life and death. The sanction of life, the promise of life, is symbolized by the tree of life. And we know that it's not just temporal life, but life everlasting, because in Genesis 3, after Adam and Eve sin, God expels them from the garden, puts the cherubim to block the way, to guard the way to the tree of life. And he says explicitly there, lest they reach out their hand and eat and live forever. So we know that the tree of life symbolizes eternal life. And then the death sanction is obvious because of Genesis 2, 16 and 17. You shall not eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. So you have death and you have life. The fact that these two sanctions, these two possible outcomes, one conditioned upon obedience, the other on disobedience, that implies an oath. That's what an oath is. It's just basically putting yourself under those two sanctions, those two options. And the other thing, too, is that it shouldn't surprise us that the technical language of covenant making is not there in Genesis 2, because Klein would argue that the covenant of works was not something added after creation, but was something built into man's creation in the image of God.
That's a great point.
Yeah, because he believes that the image of God itself contains this eschatological hope of glorification. And so the image of God contains within it this eschatological advancement that is being offered to Adam by the very act of creating him in the image of God. So you wouldn't expect then to find a later event called the covenant ceremony, because the covenant is built into his being made in the image of God.
And I mean, this would be, part and parcel of that heavenly goal that you were just talking about, but being made in the image of God also contains that works principle,
right?
That being made in God's image implied that Adam was to be as much like his creator as a creature could be.
Right.
And God had worked and rewarded himself for his good work, and Adam was to do the work that God gave him to do and then be rewarded by God for that good work.
That's right.
And just to borrow an analogy that it's not original with me, I heard this from someone else, but it bolsters, Lee, what you were saying about the fact that oaths don't have to be explicit, they can be implied, is that the New Testament talks in various places, more than one place, about marriage. And yet nowhere does the New Testament talk about the wedding vows.
Right.
But the wedding vows are how you become married. So they're presupposed. They have to have happened in order to be in that married state.
Yeah. And you're right. I mean, even in the Old Testament, it doesn't talk very much about this idea of marriage being a covenant. There are a couple of places where it does mention that. I think in Proverbs and then in, is it Malachi? Where it does mention covenant in relation to marriage. But those are pretty isolated. There's only a handful of verses. So, and they're pretty late in the canon too. But marriage goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 2.
True. I shouldn't have narrowed it down just to the New Testament, but you're right.
Yeah. So, I mean, all throughout the Old Testament, marriage is presupposed as having these vows and having this covenantal character to it, even though there's only a handful of verses that actually call marriage a covenant.
So,
yeah, that's a great argument. Yeah, that's very helpful.
Okay. Shall we tackle our sixth and final question?
Let's do it.
Number 6. I love the whole beyond probation thing. It's so liberating. But what is the exegetical basis for saying that Adam was under a probation?
Well, we've already hinted at it in the previous one, and that is, the dual sanctions of life and death, which are associated with the two trees, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where the threat of death is associated, and the tree of life. So that implies a probation. If you have these two outcomes, life or death, then that means there must be a probationary period when Adam is on probation, and then he's got to pass the test. And if he passes the test, then he'll be able to eat of the tree of life and live forever. I think the probation is also implied as well by the sign of the Sabbath. God worked for 6 days. We don't take those as literal 24-hour days, but in the analogy, he's being pictured as a workman. He goes about his creative labors for 6 days, and then he rests on the seventh. God enters into his own rest. He rested on the seventh day. Man being made in the image of God, which you mentioned, that the image of God itself implies being as much like God as possible. So since he's in the image of God, he too is to work. And the hope would be that after he's done working, fulfilling the earth, procreating, doing all of the cultural mandate, bringing about that megapolis that we've talked about, which is the city before it is turned into the eschatological city of God, before it is zapped with the eschatological intrusion that takes it into the heavenly arena, before it's heavenized. But he has to do all this work, creating the city, building the city, procreating, filling the earth, and imitating God, right? God is the creator, but man is doing creative work as well by doing this cultural activity. And the hope, though, is that he's not going to just do that forever with no end. He's going to do that, and that at some point, he will enter into God's Sabbath rest. And then he would have a weekly Sabbath as a sign along the way to hold out for him that ultimate eschatological Sabbath. So again, that implies a probation. Work. Once the work is done, then you rest. And another thing, too, that Kline would point out is that there was a specific probationary assignment given to Adam. And it's not explicitly stated in the text, but it's implied. It's implied by the fact that in Genesis 2:15, God placed the man in the garden to work it and to keep it. And the word to keep is the word shamar, which means to guard. And it's the same word used in Genesis 3, where the cherubim are guarding the way to the tree. So that implies he's to guard the garden, which is viewed as a holy sanctuary that is to be kept pure and holy unto God from anything that is contrary to God. And in Genesis 2, we don't know what that is. But in Genesis 3, verse 1, we're told what that is. Now the serpent was more cunning than all the beasts of the field. And so the probationary assignment that was given to Adam ultimately was to confront the serpent. The coming of the serpent into the garden was not something that took God by surprise. He ordained that to happen, specifically to test Adam. And his job was to confront the serpent and to execute God's judgment upon the serpent, to guard the sanctuary. If he had done that, then he would have been confirmed in righteousness. Now, he still would not have received the eschatological hope because he still needs to procreate and fill the earth, but he would have been confirmed in righteousness. And then he would be able to go about building megapolis, however long that would take. We don't even know. Hundreds of years, thousands of years, who knows? But that's the probation, really. The real probation is the confronting of the serpent. And we know that from the New Testament because that's the exact temptation that Christ had to face.
And we see that very clearly when he's driven out into the wilderness. But I got this from Kingdom Prologue as well. The use of Ephesians chapter 5 and the husband, wife, Adam, Eve, Christ church, parallels, comparisons and contrasts that are going on there. The point being that if you can compare Adam, Christ, and husbands with Eve and the church and sorry, I just lost the third one there. But you're looking at the fact that what Christ actually did do was to protect and guard and provide for his bride, the church. And therefore, we can read back into Genesis 3 that's what Adam was to have done for Eve. So here comes the serpent into the garden and confronts Eve. Well, where's Adam? Adam should have been to Eve what Christ was to the church.
Right. Yeah, he abdicated his responsibility.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Klein talks about, just going back to this whole issue of what's the exegetical basis for saying that Adam was under probation. Klein has a section called the probation tree on pages 103 and following in Kingdom Prologue. So he really views the probationary assignment as being focused upon that tree, which is where the serpent showed up, and that's where the conflict happened. So, page 107, he says, in the judicial encounter with Satan at the tree of judgment, man was obliged to come to a crucial decision as to his own ultimate personal loyalty. So he was to choose between, is he going to be loyal to God, or is he going to be disloyal to God and throw in his allegiance with Satan? He had to choose between these two suzerains. The true suzerain, God, his creator, the Lord of the covenant of works, or this false suzerain who is trying to pull man away from his loyalty to God. And so this decisive judicial encounter that took place at the tree of knowledge of good and evil, this was a divinely appointed judicial encounter that was the probationary assignment. And interestingly, Chris, this ties in with a question that a lot of people have, which is when you come to Christ as the second Adam and you look at his probationary assignment, we tend to think of the active and passive obedience of Christ in simplistic terms as the passive obedience of Christ is his suffering on the cross for our sins, but his active obedience is that he perfectly kept the law during his life, during his earthly ministry. And I don't deny that at all, but it's a little bit artificial because it kind of separates the two a little bit too much. In reality, the active obedience of Christ it includes all that obedience to the law throughout his life, but it comes to a climax, it comes to a head in his obedient and voluntary act of going to the cross in obedience to his heavenly Father, according to the terms of the Father's covenant of works with the Son as the second Adam, and in opposition to the temptation of the serpent who is trying to derail him from going to the cross. And so the active obedience of Christ does not exclude his suffering. It actually climaxes in his suffering. And so that's why Paul says in Philippians 2:8 that he was obedient to the point of death. So even the death of Christ is part of the active obedience of Christ. If you view it from the angle of his active, voluntary laying down his life, going to the cross, defeating the serpent by doing so. So the probationary assignments are very parallel, even to that point of the crisis.
That's very interesting.
And by the way, I would like to point out, this is not completely new to Klein. I mean, if you look at the Reformed tradition, almost all of the major Reformed theologians recognize that the active and passive obedience of Christ are not two separate things, as if the active is only up until the cross and then the passive begins at the cross,
right,
or begins at maybe in the Garden of Gethsemane or something. No, they recognize that the active and passive are so interconnected that really it's one obedience. And then you can look at it from two different angles. And that even the death of Christ is part of his active obedience.
Yeah, you can find that in lots of Reformed systematic theologies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can find it in Turretin, you can find it in, all of them pretty much. So.
Okay. I think that about wraps up our question and answer session.
I think so. And of course, there are many other questions that people may have. And if any of you who are listening do have additional questions that have been sparked by listening to these, please go ahead and contact us, and we will try to address them.
Yep. Please send those in. I'm still eagerly waiting for somebody to leave voicemail so that we can actually interact with some audio on the show here.
Yeah, that'd be great. We could play a little snippet of it and then respond. Yeah.
So, all right. Thank you, Lee. Come back next week for another episode of the Glory Cloud podcast, and let us know what you think in the meantime.